what's a failover cluster? That is the main thing that we're going to be talking about today. So things like, what do you need in a cluster? Like, how do you make one? Like, what are the requirements needed to make a cluster? And how a cluster is made. And then I'm going to go through some struggles and things I had throughout making the project, and present what I have made for you guys, and why it's important, like why should we use clusters, failover clusters, and then questions later on. So to start off, well, what is a cluster? Well, a cluster is basically a group of interconnected computers with Ethernet cable that allow you to create with a bunch of machines, make it look like there's one machine. So basically what it does is it kind of breaks up the load of a machine. So if you have a load intensive machine, maybe you want to cluster that and make it so that only parts of that load are being split up in between those computers. So you, in a cluster you can have as many computers as you want interconnected to make a cluster. So specifically, what is a failover cluster? Failover cluster is otherwise known as a high availability cluster, and it supports server applications. And what it does is it allows you to, when you create this cluster, when a service is running on this cluster and something were to go down with one of the machines that was created, that whatever was happening on that machine will then be transferred over from that machine to another working machine, thus creating high availability, nothing will ever go down, things like that. So with this picture, you have your LAN obviously, which is what the box I have sitting here. You have your two nodes, which is the machines that I have sitting here. Those are my two nodes that I've created. And then you have your shared storage. That's what allows them to create that storage together, is that shared storage. Okay, so what do you need in a cluster? Well, you need at least 3 machines. 2 of them need to be the exact same machine. Make sure, that is one huge thing, is to make sure that these machines have the exact same hardware components, because if they don't, they can conflict with each other, they don't agree with one another, things like that. You need something called RJ45 cable. For people who don't know, that's just Ethernet cable. And then you would need a network switch to be able to plug all those into it. And then after that, you would need an OS to run all of it. So, how is a failover cluster made? Well, as you guys can see on the left-hand side of the screen, we have the machines that I use to create this cluster. So we have host 1, which is on the top, host 2, which is over here, up maybe. And then we have my laptop, which is the machine that allows me to see what's happening with the cluster. And then obviously to connect the machines, you connect it using a switch. So with a cluster, you need some sort of OS. And the OS that I decided to use was something called ESXi. And what this is it is a Linux kernel that allows you to be able to make the cluster with something called VMware. So basically you would install it using a disk or a flash drive, and it is a free software, so anybody can use this. You just go on the website, search ESXi, free download, and you can download it from their site. So to install the operating system, first you want to install the USB stick into the computer and power on the machine, and while the machine is powering on, press F12, and that allows you to pick the different types of boot options you want to try to boot from. So in this case, I ended up doing a CD, so I went down to the CD drive and pressed enter, and it booted straight into ESXi, the installer. So let's get on with continuing the installation. So with installing it, first you have to select the hard drive that you want to have this boot off of, and then after you press enter on that, it asks you for a root password. So this password is what's going to allow you to be able to log into this machine every time. So make sure that you use a password that you're not going to forget. And then after you press enter on that one, then it'll start to install ESXi. So with installing the operating system, when it's installed, this is the type of this is the screen you're going to see when you first boot it up. So one of the first main things you want to do is to configure your IP address with the cluster, because they need to all be in the same subnet, which that means they all need to be in the same group of IP addresses so that they can connect or talk to one another. So you go down to Configure Management Network by pressing F2 on the screen, and this is what you would get. And then on the other one, and then on the next screen, sorry, these are a lot more blurrier than they were showing earlier. But with IPv4, you will go down to IPv4 address, set the address, and for instance, the first host machine is 192.168.0.2. Then you would set the subnet mask to 255.255.255.0. And then you would set the default gateway. Consider I want my first host machine to be the domain controller. We're going to get into domain controllers a little bit later. But you set the default gateway to 192.168.0.1. So after you get all that configured on both machines, so that was just showing you on one machine, you're going to want to do that exact same thing on the other machine as well, but make sure that the IP address is one above the one that you just set. So if I set the first one to be 0.2, make sure that other one's 0.3. When you configure the virtual machines, VMware is actually not a VMware can be used as a is more of a web interface instead of like an actual operating system where you configure everything in that operating system. You configure everything on the web interface, which that is something I really enjoyed about using this. Was you don't have to make sure you configure everything on both machines at one time. You can do it all from that one machine. So yeah, let's keep going. So in order to make a cluster, you have to create something called a virtual machine. A virtual machine is basically a computer that is inside of your computer that uses your computer's resources. And you don't have to use as many resources as you would through your actual machine. Plus, it helps with like being able to practice on it and stuff like that. So if you're struggling with something and you want to be able to practice on it without damaging your physical machine, that's a great way to do it. So with the configuring a virtual machine, you first want to name your virtual machine, and I named it cluster because that's what I'm going to be making here in a second. You also want to select your ESXi 6.5 ISO, which is the boot disk image to be able to boot to you pick the boot option, which is not ESXi. I said that wrong. It is Windows Server 2016. So that's the one we're going to be using to be able to create that cluster. Then you're also going to, on the next page over here, this is where you're going to be configuring everything. So you're going to be giving it how much memory you want, how much hard disk space you want. And then down below where it says the hard disk one, you select that, and then you click your virtual machine. So after everything is configured the way you want it to be, just make sure you press finish. Everything just looks the way you want it to, things like that. And then you just press finish and it will create the virtual machine. So once you're inside the virtual machine, first thing you're going to want to do is change the IP addresses of those machines. so that those machines can also talk to one another. So when you go into the IPv4 settings, the way you do that is you would go to the network adapter options and do right-click, click properties, and continue to change your IP address. So with this IP address, I changed it to 192.168.0.3, and then I set the subnet mask 255.0. Then you create the DNS server, which is 192.168.0.1 again, just like I said earlier. And then after you're done configuring both IP addresses on both machines, what you're going to want to do is install something called the DNS server and the DHCP server. The DNS server is the dynamic name server, and what it allows you to do is to be able to create something called a forward and reverse lookup zone. And what those allow you to do is reverse look up the IP addresses that you have set so that they can find each other. That's how they're able to find each other. So yeah, you would set that. And once you get that set up, this is kind of what it looks like here. So up in the, I know it's super hard to read, up in the top left-hand corner there's something called DNS, and then you have the forward and lookup, forward and reverse lookup zones, and just like I said earlier, that's how those computers find one another through that network, is through that. And then, so then after you create that, you want to, so I'm going to show you guys what this VMware is firsthand. So we're going to get to that at the end of the presentation so I can show you guys after. So after that, you guys will configure something called vCenter. And what vCenter is it allows you, this is where you actually create the cluster. So you will continue your, you continue the installation guide. And then on the other side of the screen over here, this is where you would change, where you would want to enable SSH configuration. And what SSH means, it allows you to use something called PuTTY, which allows you to go inside the console of that machine and configure it with different things that you would like to configure it with. So you would make sure that's enabled. And then over here, you would configure the name of what you would want the vCenter to be called, and then you would set your password. And then over on the right-hand side, just make sure everything is set the way you want it to be set, and go from there. Click finish. Okay, so this is the when it's installing. So just let that run through, and it will eventually work. And this is where the part that I ran into problems. See right here, this message is talking about how it's not able to communicate with the IP address. It just can't, for some reason, find the IP address. It found the IP address, but it wasn't able to find the actual page itself, I guess. So that was where I ran into issues. So if I could show you guys, this is so unfortunately I never was actually able to get the cluster working. That was the hardest part for me to do, was the network, trying to get the network to communicate with one another was a really, really hard struggle for me to do. I've looked up many things on how to do it, and I did those things, and nothing seemed to work. So I figured I might as well show you guys what it should be like instead of sitting here with nothing. So, so when you first log into vCenter, after you go to the IP address that you set with it, so that is something I forgot to mention. So on that second machine as well, you want to install something called VSCA, and that is vSphere vCenter Service Appliance, and that allows you to communicate with the IP address of the actual web interface. So what you would do is you would install it the same way that you would install the ESXi. You would set the IP address to what you want it to be, make sure it's in that same server, or make sure it's in that same IP address pool, and you would be able to find it. So with VMware Sphere, so when you first type in the IP address, this is where you're brought to. And so you would type in the root password and the root username that you would create on that machine. And then after you log in, this is what you would be brought to. So it's really hard to see right here. This is where it says hosts and clusters. And this is exactly where you would go to create the cluster. Okay, so when you go to create the cluster, you would right-click up above the on the little file thing there, and you would click Create the Cluster, and then right here, this dialog box would pop up, and you would give it a name, and you wouldn't have to mess with any of the other settings in there, so you would just click OK. And then this is what the vSphere service appliance would create. It would create the cluster. It would create the cluster to have it working. So just like I said, some struggles throughout this presentation. The biggest one for me was networking communication. Just setting all the IP addresses and things wasn't working out the way I wanted it to work out. And another one too was licensing issues. So when we went to go install vSphere, it told us we had a 60-day free trial license. And then we went to go install it, and nothing worked. It said we didn't have a valid license. And unfortunately, vSphere is not cheap at all. It is $800 for the license. So we were kind of sad about, I was kind of sad about that. If you guys don't know, I worked alongside my boss. His name was Jonathan McCaughey. He helped me, he guided me through making this type of cluster, because I've never worked with VMware before. So he was the one that was trying to get me the license, but that never ended up actually working. And obviously the other one was to get vSphere to work. So I think that might be the end of that. Okay. So why is clustering important? Well, just like I said at the beginning, you have something called high availability. And that allows you to, if something were to fail, it would be transferred over to that other machine, and then thus makes the machines never go down. So let me show you guys a little bit of what VMware actually looks like. Okay, so we're on my desktop, and then we'll go over to the, so you type in the same address that you set to the ESXi operating system. So you go to your Google here, and then you would type in, so let's say I would type in 192.168.0.3, or let's do 0.2. So 0.2, you click enter, and then it would bring up something like this. So this is what VMware looks like. It's pretty simple stuff. So you would log in with your credentials. For instance, mine is root, and then I will log into here. And so this is exactly what VMware looks like. So like I said earlier, to create a virtual machine, you go over to the side of the screen here, and you click it, and then you click create and register a VM. And that way you would just go through all the steps and things like that. But for instance, this is Windows Server 2016. So I created a domain controller. So here's what that would look like, as long as it runs for me. So it's booting into Windows Server 2016 now. Maybe. Jeremy, I missed out on PCI Gen 4, aren't I? Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and log in here. So the unfortunate part with this is that you can't just press Control-Alt-Delete to try to get into this virtual machine. You have to go all the way through and find the Control-Alt-Delete option, which then allows you to type in your password. Do that every time. Okay. So this is what the virtual machine looks like. So in a second here, it'll pop up something called Server Manager, and this is where it allows you to add those roles and features that I showed you guys earlier with the domain controller and the DNS and DHCP. So if you go over here to Tools, actually I'll show you first. If you go to Manage, if you allow me to go there you go. Add roles and features. So it's actually fairly simple. In my opinion, it is a very user-friendly environment, because everything that you might want to install, so like if you click Next, Next, Next. So these are all the different types of roles and features you can add to the Hyper-V, or to the Windows Server, and each one tells you exactly what it does, so that makes it very user-friendly. So as you can see, we configured DNS with the forward and reverse lookup zones, and with the DHCP as well. Yeah, considering I couldn't get the actual cluster to work without it complaining about something about the web interface, that's all I got for you guys. Do you guys have any questions?
How many machines can you link in a cluster?
You can link as many as you want. I've known some. I looked up a video of a guy creating a cluster, and he had like over 20, 30 machines clustered all into one to make it look like a big machine. Because I know my boss, Jonathan McCaughey, was telling me about a time where his friend would always create clusters because the very high intensive load types of applications that he would want to create didn't allow for the type of hardware that he was using. The hardware was really slow. So he would create those clusters, and instead of 16 gigs of RAM, it would show 64 if he created a four computer virtual machines. Or instead of a dual core, it would be more of an 8-core processor now. So it would just split up the load. Any more? Joel?
So if you use VMware, why not do something like Kubernetes?
Honestly, to be honest, I didn't look into Kubernetes very much. When I was talking to a boss, he told me that in his experience, that VMware is the best one to use because it's been around the longest. And originally I was using Hyper-V, Windows Hypervisor, and I was having super bad luck with that operating system, and nothing would want to work for me. So that's kind of why I switched to using VMware. Plus, I also like the aspect that it's an online web interface. Is Kubernetes also a web interface? What? Yeah. Because that's just one big reason I like that as well. Is because you don't have to configure each individual machine, like plug in a keyboard to each individual machine or a monitor. You can do it all from one machine here. So if you had 8 machines using VMware ESXi, you could do it all from one machine, which is super nice. Any other questions?
Why not?
Go for it.
So when I get on my computer at home, every once in a while, they allow you to use your computer as a sharing for other people for downloads and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of like clustering where they're allowing your computer to do some of the work for another person who's trying to share out stuff, or is that a completely different thing?
I wouldn't say, it can be an aspect of it. So when you create clustering, it allows you to use that sharing kind of software, but I wouldn't say that that sharing appliance part of it uses clustering.
Because it's not actually doing work, it's just
Yeah.
sharing data
Mm-hmm.
from a different location.
Mhm.
Okay.
Ms. Todd?
So it's unfortunate that it didn't come together for you, but it sounds like if I heard that you have done this twice. You did it on Hyper-V and
Yes.
Windows, and then you did it on VMware.
Yes.
Do you still learn things when projects fail?
Yes. I mean, even though I couldn't figure out how to get this to work, like, I've learned so much more about using a virtual machine in general, because I really hadn't used one at all very much in the first place before using this. So being able to configure all these settings and things like that on this virtual machine, that was the part that was really cool to me that I've never actually been able to do. And to get those configurations to actually work was actually pretty cool too. Another one for me was when I first looked at Windows Server 2016, when I originally looked at it first, it was Windows Server 2012. And when I first saw that Server Manager pop up, I was just like, whoa, what is this? And now it's like, oh, I know exactly where to get that. I know where we can do this and where we can do that. Like where to go to get this thing and where to go to get that thing. So, and I've also learned a lot about like networking, more about like how to set the IP addresses, like static IP addresses, and get them to talk to one another through DHCP and DNS and Active Directory and things like that.
So you wouldn't call it a complete wash in your mind?
No.
How many hours did you work on the project?
Between both or between just one?
From the time you were assigned this project till today, how many hours have you
About
worked?
61 or 62 hours.
And for those of you that might be in the room, he took this for 1 credit hour of an internship, which is 40 hours of required work. You can make your own mind up about that. You said you worked with Mr. McCammon, and he
Yes.
works where?
He works over at the high school. I work over at the high school as well. I'm an intern as well with Wade. He's just our boss. And he's heard about my interest in creating a failover cluster, and he was like, well, would you mind if I were to like step in on that, like guide you with it? Like not only guide you, but follow along with you, because with having a school full of servers and things like that, that is something that he does not have implemented, that he would love to have implemented. Because having that high availability around a school, never losing anything like a teacher file share or student file share, is really helpful. Any other questions?
Do you think you all will continue working on this?
Yeah, I think even with not getting it to create, it has really spiked my interest. For example, Jeremy, your war sister, was talking to me about something earlier about creating something called a nested VM. So basically what that means is it allows you to create a virtual machine inside a virtual machine. And that it just allows for more high availability as well. So that is something I've wanted to, he was telling me about, and I've kind of wanted to create that as well. But with an AMD processor, that is not possible at the moment until you get a higher Windows server, or you could use any Intel chip and it would work. So I think I'm going to try that too.
Thank you.
Yep. Any more questions, guys? All right. Well, I really appreciate you guys coming today. Thank you.
We do appreciate your time. If you'd make time to fill out the form and give him some good feedback. It's always good to get the feedback.